Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Megan Donaldson, Global Alumni Relations Officer here at Trinity Development and Alumni, and you're all very welcome to today's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar on navigating cybersecurity and knowing who and what to trust with your data online. I'm delighted to welcome our guest speakers today, who are joining us from Trinity School of Computer Science and Statistics and the ADAPT Center for Digital Content Research. They will be sharing insights into the evolving world of online security and AI and how to evaluate what you see online. The talk today will last around 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for audience questions at the end of the talk. We encourage as much audience interaction as possible, so please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and you're welcome to pop them in as you think of them throughout the webinar. I'd like to note that we are using Zoom-generated automatic subtitles, and you can turn these off or on by clicking the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and click either show or hide subtitles. I'd like to note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our Trinity Alumni YouTube channel. To start off, I would like to introduce our MC for today's talk, Dr. Dave Lewis. Dr. Lewis is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science and Statistics at Trinity. He is also associate director of the ADAPT Center for Digital Content Research and an ADAPT principal investigator, leading its research on data governance for digital content. With over 160 peer-reviewed publications, his research addresses the use of semantic models to manage the data protection and data ethics issues raised by digital content processing. I'll hand you over to Dr. Lewis now, who will introduce our other panelists.
Thanks, Megan. Delighted to be here. And thank you for organising this really interesting event. So I'd like to introduce our three panelists in turn. So first I'll start with Professor Owen Conlan. So Owen is a professor in Trinity School of Computer Science and Statistics. And he was one of the 7 founding principal investigators of the ADAPT Research Centre for Digital Content Technology. So this is one of Ireland's clutch of large research centres. And Owen's internationally recognised for his work in personalisation and user modelling, especially online. And this involves developing novel techniques in artificial intelligence, in knowledge engineering, and in visual data analytics to help deliver new understandings of how users, you and me, interact with the rich informational experiences that we're now offered every day on the internet via our phones. Okay, then I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Stephen Farrell. So Stephen is a research fellow, also in the School of Computer Science and Statistics in Trinity College. And here he teaches and researches on security, privacy, and the area of delayed or disruption tolerant networking. Stephen's been involved in security, especially in industry, since the mid-80s, and he's been involved in the international activities of setting internet standards since the 1990s. So he has served on the Internet Architecture Board and is a co-founder of Tolerant Networks Limited, which is a TCD campus company which offers security and privacy related products and services. Okay, and then finally, I'd like to introduce Clare Conran. Clare is a member of the Design and Innovation team, or what we call D-Lab, in the ADAPT Center, where she's responsible for driving industry partnered projects. The D-Lab are a team of postdoctoral researchers, research engineers, designers, and program managers who work closely with researchers in Trinity and our other partner institutions to develop impactful prototype solutions to industry problems. So working very closely with industry. This team are embedded in the ADAPT Spokes program, which is our industry co-funded program, and specializes in collaborative research with a wide range of industry partners. Okay, so what we're planning to do, therefore, is go through a series of questions, 3 groups of questions, and I'll kick that off. Really, perhaps with a question directed first at Stephen. Broadly, Stephen, and then perhaps the others can join in later. How can we know that our access to the web at a fundamental level is secure and private from prying eyes?
Hey, thanks, Dave, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and good afternoon or morning, depending on your time zone, or evening, I guess. I guess I'd start by just pointing out, I mean, I think the name of the webinar here uses the term cybersecurity, and I think it's worth pointing out that that's not a well-defined term. So I think often if somebody is using that term, they're really trying to sell you something. So typically I would rather talk about security and privacy, as you did yourself, Dave. And I guess there's kind of 3 kind of ways I would kind of think about that if we want to talk about it for a few minutes. First off is thinking about security and privacy for you as a person, using the internet and doing things on it. And separately and a little bit differently, you might want to think about security and privacy for your information, as the data about you, the information you have. And then finally, because I guess we have some probably high-powered executive Trinity alumni on the call, you may also want to think about security and privacy for information and systems you control if you're running a business or a laboratory or whatever. So I think the answer to your question kind of varies a little bit from those 3 different perspectives. And I guess I'd talk about them a little bit, one after the other. Let's just make a couple of points. I guess as a person, I would think, a fundamental thing is, as you're interacting with services on the web, is don't be creating accounts all over the place. Be more conservative about that. As time goes on, personally, I've become more and more allergic to creating new accounts for various things, because kind of every account you create on different services is leaving kind of breadcrumbs and footprints behind all over the place. And even with the best will in the world, the service providers who might want to do a great job, they may fail slightly and information may leak, or perhaps they're not all considering your interests at the top of their mind. They might be rather more interested in making profit. Another thing to think about is, just think about what information about yourself are you okay having visible on the internet? Your home address, is that okay? Is it not okay? It's not a thing you get to kind of reset very often, but sometimes if you move home, you could then start to think about, should I continue to share as much information as I have been in the past? Same happens when if you change device, you can then, it gives you a chance to kind of do some partial resetting. Then if you think about, as opposed to as a person, but if you think about the information you have, I mean, I think there's a fundamental thing is to kind of, do sensible things like backups. That's the number one thing you can do to protect yourself against risks on the internet, is basically to have some kind of backup. That means that for the information you care about, it can come back if an event happens, or that's kind of harmful. And generally consider risk. So what is the information that you have that's important to you? It might be a collection of images or music or the novel you're halfway through writing or whatever. So consider what is it that you want to kind of back up and protect. A useful way of thinking about that, though, in practice is, just very practically, you can consider the different things you do online and try and partition them. So what do I mean by that? If, let's say, you might consider that your banking activity is somewhat sensitive versus checking the weather, and it's quite possible to assert quite a bit of control over those kind of things if you take a little bit of time to think about them. And so, for example, one way is, personally, if I'm doing banking, I won't use a phone. I'll only do banking myself on a laptop that I have a bit more control over than over a handset. Particularly on a laptop, but also on a phone, you can install different browsers, and they can have different profiles. And so that you could use the Brave browser, which is a kind of one that aims to protect privacy a bit better for certain activities, and then use the built-in default browser for your system, perhaps for more generic activities like checking the weather or whatnot. And again, you can, with a lot of these tools, they have kind of privacy improvements available. So if you think about the Firefox browser, particularly on desktops or laptops, there's a really useful kind of set of extensions that can protect your privacy. One I use a lot is called NoScript. And what that basically does is it reduces the amount of things that websites can run whilst you're browsing. And essentially, that there's a concept we think of called the attack surface, which is it's just a conceptual idea of how much at risk am I? What's the surface that could be attacked? And generally, we think making that smaller is better. And installing plugins like NoScript in a Firefox environment can basically reduce the attack surface. And the same is true of various other browser settings. Now, unfortunately, it's true to say that a lot of this is kind of technical, hard to understand sometimes, but you can typically, if you do a bit of searching online, you can find out, how can I improve my privacy using Safari on iOS or using Firefox on a laptop and so on. So, in terms of your own information, that's I'd leave it at that. Then lastly, the last point I wanted to just briefly touch on is if you are in control of systems. So if you're, the boss of a company or a system administrator or a head of a sales team, you're probably controlling information that belong to yourself as well and other people, employees, customers, possible customers, random people visiting your website. So what I think there is we each have a kind of a duty of some sort to consider the ethics of the situation ourselves and don't be invasive, but kind of respect the people using your systems. And I think that's a good ethical position to take, but also it's a kind of a sound position from a risk point of view, because if you are running some systems, you really need to consider that anything you collect, any information you collect may leak in future. And that kind of leakage can happen because some partner system that you're depending on, some cloud provider, or your own organization might basically have some security issue. That means that the data that you're collecting in the future leaks, and that would cause, that would basically get you in a lot of trouble. So the more you collect, the more risk you're kind of accumulating for your organization. It's really, it's a sound kind of both ethically and from a risk management point of view position to think of, to say, minimize what you're collecting. If you can get rid of data, if you could throw it away, throw it away. And before you really want to keep it for a long time, think hard about, does it actually add value, or are you just collecting everything because you can? And the because you can part obviously touches on some kind of regulatory issues like the GDPR in Europe, that you should be collecting data for a purpose, etc. And lastly, if you are running systems like that, I think in today's world you should be ready for ransomware. So we saw for the attack on the HSE systems, the health authority here in Ireland, over the summer, and that caused huge damage. And the lesson there essentially is to get ready for that, practice, keep practicing, and practice more as to how you would recover from that. Again, the answer is kind of, ultimately the answer is a backup, but it's a little bit more complex, obviously, if you're running a system as complex as the HSEs or any companies, essentially. So I would, if you're controlling systems like that, again, I would, consider, what's the right ethical position to take in terms of collecting other people's information and processing that. And in terms of your own systems, be ready for ransomware. That's probably the number one thing I would take as a lesson today. And then finally, just to summarize all of that, I guess, it's really about actively considering risk. What's the probability that something bad might happen? What's the possible impact? And I think that applies whether you're thinking about your actions as a person, about your information, or about systems that you control. So yeah, I slightly long-winded, sorry, but that's a quick overview of my answer to your question, and I could go on for many more hours if you want me to, but you don't, so I won't.
Yeah, no, that's great, Stephen. I definitely get that message there, just both from a personal responsibility and a commercial responsibility to minimize the amount of data that's out there, just to manage your risk. One question that came through, you were talking about minimizing the number of accounts you might have. How does systems like OpenID, where you use your Google ID, for example, to log into lots of third-party sites, how does that factor into that? Does it improve the situation, or does it not make much difference?
So it's a double-edged sword, really. So as I guess the questioner is pointing out, you can use your Google account essentially, or your Facebook account, or some other kind of account, in order to sign on to multiple systems. That's a good from the point of view. You don't have to invent a new password that might be terrible or might be written on a yellow notepad or whatever. On the other hand, you actually are allowing those kind of, particularly those kind of mega corporations, to collect more and more information about you. So it creates more linkages. So that's the negative. I would point out there's a lovely service on the internet called randomuser.me. which exists essentially to provide you with all of the information to fill in a form to create an account with totally random information, but accurate information. So you could create an account for a Dutch user with a real Dutch address, real in the sense of passing all the tests, but not being real in the sense of not being a place. So you could also evade as well as kind of buy into all this kind of thing. So, but bottom line is, it's a double-edged sword to use those kind of federated sign-on systems.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I think just in the interest of time, we might move on to sort of the next sort of area of questioning. And I see some questions coming up in the Q&A, which I'll sort of feed in as we go forward. So next one really sort of directed primarily at Owen here. Owen, I'm just wondering, I know you've researched in these areas, but how can we tell the content that we are dealing with online, and we spend more and more of our days looking at screens, getting our news in that way. So how do we deal with that sort of parallel problem to sort of security and privacy? How do we deal with the fact that can we really trust the information that we see? Is somebody perhaps either accidentally or possibly maliciously trying to mislead us, or there's active misinformation there? So be interested in your thoughts on that, Owen.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see information coming in many different forms at us, and the challenge is, how do you approach that information? Do you initially start from a skeptical point of view? And I think with the internet as it stands and the kind of information that we interact with, I think you have to be skeptical. Because there is misinformation out there. So misinformation is information is just incorrect for whatever reason. And then there's disinformation, and this is deliberate manipulation of the situation of information, how facts are presented, and the surrounding narrative in order to present a certain perspective. So I think the initial point is treat every bit of information as though it's a rumor. So what do you do with a rumor? Well, that might come down to individual beliefs and so on, but be skeptical. And if it's something that you're going to share and pass on in particular, go and try and verify if that is information that from your perspective, your worldview is true. And this is the challenge with what truth is on the internet, because it does represent many, many different perspectives, some of which are very heavily biased, some of which are less so. So for me, one of the first truth tests I have on a piece of information is, how much emotion is there in this piece I'm reading? Because you often find that emotional cues are used to try and trigger a reaction. So, a story about a vaccine and a bad effect, but it's very personalized, and it's trying to draw out the human trauma of it. Well, pause for a moment to see, does that meet some level of journalistic quality that you might anticipate? So it's that kind of very subjective, very emotive side of things. The other thing is look out for other features. So things like the writing quality of the material that you're reading, the use of certain images. Is the image there to kind of, again, reinforce a certain perspective? It's showing people in certain situations, and does that resonate with the material that's going on? And also to look at other factors of saying, well, how did this information come to me? Is it part of a feed? I think we'll hit on algorithmic feeds in a little bit. But is it part of a feed, or is it something that has been pushed at me by somebody in particular? And do I agree with their worldview? So as I said, one of the things you can definitely do is go and fact check these things. So I think many of us have heard of websites like Snopes. So you go and check, see, is this story real? Particularly before you share it. And I think this is where we run into a challenge. You see information out there that's deliberate parody. Waterford Whispers as a good example. And if it's parody, that's fine. But if you share that information, whether it's parody, whether you're sharing to say, isn't this ludicrous? You don't necessarily understand how another person might interpret it. And this is where the challenge lies. So, parody tends to be so ludicrous that we all know it's kind of off the wall. But we don't always. When you look at the comment sections on Waterford Whispers, some people get sucked in by this. But it's the gray area information where you share something and it's disinformation and it's silly, but somebody else might pick it up as fact and incorporate it into their worldview. And we've obviously seen the impact that that's had on fundamental structures in our society, such as kind of democratic principles, because you get very heavily skewed narratives. And there's an awful lot of effort out there to both have human fact checking, so big organizations like First Draft, trying to give a perspective on this. And that instantly raises some challenges, challenges such as authority. who has the authority to arbitrate on what news is more truthy and less truthy? Because, as we say, sliding scales in here. So you mentioned the kind of the research side. I'm working on a project at the moment that's led by Dublin City University and the Future Media Institute there, called Provenance. Provenance is funded by the European Commission. And what Provenance looks at is this tool that sits on the side of your internet activities and offers some insight into the materials. So things like I was saying, well, to identify if something is very heavily emotionally sentimented, how does this fit with kind of the norms of well-written material and so on? Has this image reoccurred in other contexts? And are we seeing this story that you're reading? Is it a new story? Is it an old story? Are there a lot of other similar emergent stories at this moment? Or is there anything in particular about this story that is divergent? So a good example there was when the fire at Notre Dame happened. You've got a lot of mainstream reporting of this, but we saw some reporting bring in Islamist and Muslim as keywords in stories around that, trying to connect the fire in Notre Dame as an attack. And those stories are then quite out of step at a semantic level with what's going on. And again, so the imagery that they would have utilized being quite different. And having a tool to help you identify that is one thing. So unfortunately, it goes back to something that Stephen was saying. It does require personal responsibility. And this is always a challenge on the internet, because the time it takes to be responsible, that is the time it takes, to go and after you've read a story to say, should I try and see this from another perspective, see if anybody else is commenting on it. So unfortunately, it takes time. Yeah.
And, Owen, I think an interesting, you're talking about the personal responsibility aspects of that, but, obviously you're also researching the, the technological aspects of that. And there's a raft of technologies that have supported in the past personalization, often with the aim of helping people find or recommend to them content that the algorithm thinks is interesting to them. But do you want to say a little bit about how much of a role do you think that perhaps that technology can be in also recommending or propagating both misinformation and disinformation or otherwise harmful information algorithmically?
Yeah, so going back to the phrase double-edged sword, I think personalization offers great potential to cut out the amount of noise and challenge that we encounter on the internet and try and focus us towards material that's going to be relevant and appropriate for us. But the challenge there is, and we've probably heard this phrase, the filter bubble, where what it does is it pulls us into a very constrained space where the items are being recommended are very similar to other things we've seen, not necessarily content-wise, but in perspective, because it brings in the social signal, what others who are like you have encountered. So for me, personalization has a big responsibility in terms of an area of research to ensure that balance is maintained. So balance in trying to reduce the cognitive load of interacting with these very big noisy systems so we can actually get to the good stuff. But also to ensure that when we recognize problems, so I mentioned provenance there as a project, that personalization can be part of the solution. So for us, I mentioned the idea of this plugin that's helping you identify this material, but it also incorporates developing media literacy skills so that we are becoming more savvy as users of this kind of complex information. And the way that the media literacy is incorporated is tailored towards your action and engagement with content. So it's personalized in that way. And the hope there is that you will take those skills into other contexts where you don't have that tool or that tool set available to you. So it's that personal development side. So I think personalization definitely has a responsibility when it comes to algorithmic control. And I think this is something I hope we'll see change over time, because we're starting to see large scale conversations around ethics, scrutability of how AI systems function on our behalf, and starting to, and this is the challenge for us as ordinary users, starting to think about how we might offer more control to us as users over how those algorithms function on our behalf. The conversation at the moment is, well, can you get it just to turn off the recommendation algorithm and get it to do it in maybe just temporal sequencing? And I think quite quickly we'd see that we end up with a whole lot of noise that's presented to us, but equally then it's for us to manually filter and sift through. So I think it's an ongoing conversation where personalization will land as both an enabling technology, but also one that doesn't over-focus us.
Yeah. So, I mean, just very quickly, I mean, again, there was a question, just talking in general about this feeling that perhaps initially motivated by, the benefits of personalization, but now just in general, companies are gathering more and more information about us. And that is, a double-edged sword. So Stephen was talking about, well, perhaps we should just minimize the amount of data that's out there. But given a lot of it is being collected and we're often enticed to do that, how do you feel, the measures that might be able to help us deal with that? Are they going to be perhaps more technical or perhaps more legislative or again, down to personal responsibility?
I think they start off, first off, I fully agree with Stephen. I think we need to strive towards data minimization, and in ADAPT as a research center, it's one of our core tenets is to see how effectively we can offer things like personalization with as little information about the users as is possible. And also, I think as Stephen said, to not retain that information for longer than is needed. There's sometimes you figure out what the action is, then dispose of the information upon which that was decided. But I think in terms of legislative move towards this, I think the first step is actually, before we get there for legislation always tails the technology by kind of 10 years or longer. It's people starting to vote with their clicks and choose sites and services that are explicitly saying that they will not store certain types of information. In a way, we as consumers have some degree of choice in terms of products that are greener for the environment. And we're still in this funny phase when it comes to personal data, where there is a certain amount of, in the same way we've kind of companies that greenwash, we have people, companies that kind of personal data wash, where they make certain claims will still gather. But I think, as with everything, we'll see a movement towards more genuine minimization of data gather. Also, as consumers appreciating that, because I think we see the danger is that, when data breaches happen and there is this big kind of massive warehouse of data that's been gathered and a big chunk of it about you, connected up about you, kind of say, well, why did I put it out there into those services? Was it really needed? And, vote with your non-clicks as well as you're filling in a form for a new service. And you kind of go, why are they asking this? Can I either not give this information, not proffer it, or actually just not use this service? So, and that's hard because there's a big social pressure to use these various different services because our friends, colleagues are utilizing them. So I think we're in a very interesting Wild West situation that I hope will become a little bit more controlled, both by user choice, but also legislative action.
That's great. No, thanks, Owen. That's brilliant. And I can see some more questions coming up, so I'll focus on those. But again, with an eye on the time, I think we'll perhaps move on to our sort of third area of discussion. Obviously we're in a university where we're educating people, and some of these issues come up in the courses we teach. But Claire, I think you're in a very interesting role. Working in a centre like ADAPT, where your day-to-day bridging between what people are doing in industry and what people who have their PhDs or doing their PhDs are learning, and the attitudes that they bring to some of these issues, and then especially how that sort of moves from the university environment through spin outs, which again in this area is somewhere we've had some good successes recently in Trinity and in ADAPT. So what do you see there? Given that these are big problems with a lot of folks, what do you see as sort of the opportunities for entrepreneurs in this sort of startup domain for trying to address some of these concerns around security and privacy and trustworthiness?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So I think the real opportunity for startups in particular is that they can build in these considerations around democratization and equity of access to data and the utility of it, like into the fabric of their product and their business plan and the market that they're looking to serve. So they can better ensure anyway and anticipate that respect and empathy for their users and their consumers is really at the forefront of how they are devising and conceiving, developing, testing, validating their product ideas. So I think there are two spin-outs that I can think of that are being incubated in ADAPT at the moment, that sort of that come to mind, who are sort of leveraging this sort of idea in different ways. So there's Move Ahead, and Darwin and Goliath. So I think Move Ahead are a good example of bringing more equity to sort of data access and utility, and creating sort of a trustworthy, secure experience for their end users. So one of the co-founders is actually a former PhD student of Owen's, Dr. Jamie McCann, and he's also a former national school teacher. So he is their end users are children, are minors, and they're looking to sort of create technology that will better serve and give a richer informational experience for technology such as, the Connect and Wii and that kind of thing, because the small children aren't well served in that particular sort of technology cohort. But in the way that they have designed and conceived their technology and how it's delivered, it threaded throughout their entire sort of design is real respect for their end user, for the children that they're looking to serve, and they're providing security and trustworthiness and compliance, but over and above compliance as well, and that is absolutely threaded throughout their business plan, how they're serving their market, everything. And then another example of sort of how data can be democratized in a sort of commercial sense would be, I think, our Darwin and Goliath spin out. So these are they're creating a AI recommender system which is empowering SMEs to give sort of product recommendations across a lot of sort of online domains. It means that, the really, mega data houses such as Google, don't, they're not sort of creating the monopoly that they have, and it kind of returns the power to these sort of SMEs, that they can access sort of more niche cohorts of their market without having to sort of give away, all their data insights to, big sort of data houses such as Google and that kind of thing. So I think they're sort of two good examples of how to do that, and it's really just sort of fundamentally keeping it in mind when you're devising these things. Really, that's the main opportunity, I believe.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Clare. So one thing I've certainly observed over my sort of years in this computer science research is because the technology has become so successful, there's actually a real lot of responsibility on especially us as educators, but also the people that we are educating and then going out in the workforce, because the tools that they wield are very powerful, and can cause a lot of real world problems. So how do you find you deal with a lot of researchers who are entrepreneurially minded or interested in working in industry? How do you find them in terms of the skills or their outlook in looking at these? I mean, you mentioned it a little bit with some of these companies, respecting sort of users' data and having responsibility. But how do you find in general, people from universities becoming more concerned about these issues, and do they feel fully equipped to go out, if you like, into the commercial world and deal with some of these issues?
I'm not sure they always feel fully equipped, but I think a big advantage of the sort of sprint out runway that's within universities is that there's a real scaffolding there and a real support network, so you might have a really great idea, but if you want to validate it, you need to sort of go to your market that you're trying to sort of serve. But there's also an awful lot of there's other people who've walked the path ahead of you. There's lots of people who will have spun out ahead of you, and a lot of those people are more than willing to have a chat and pick the brain and figure out what they would do differently. They have lots of lots of advice in hindsight of what they might do differently. You can learn from their successes and failures. I think so. Even if you don't feel like you have all the skills, like no one, no matter where you're starting from as an entrepreneur, no one has all the skills to do all the things all the time. So with it, if you're lucky enough to be within a sort of spin out runway within a university, I would just advise them to take advantage of that infrastructure that's there for you. There's so many layers and avenues of experience and knowledge and goodwill to set you up for success. So take advantage of it would be my main advice. And as regards sort of creating really ethically sound technology, I suppose it really comes back to making sure that I'm reiterating throughout the process that there are clear boundaries within what you're willing to do within the product or the business, and just don't stray from that, and be very sort of robust with yourself and your co-founders and anyone who joins you along the journey, that like you're very boundaries in it, and what is it you're trying to achieve and how do you want to achieve it.
That's great. I mean, I think that's really a great insight there. I think it is really interesting seeing people sort of move over that boundary and the attitudes they take with them. Okay, so I think that's great. We've gone through most of our topics. I think we're going to go now to start looking at some of the online questions that people have been putting in. So thanks for that, and keep adding your questions, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So there's one question I was looking at here. Oops, it's disappeared off my screen. So and again, whoever wants to speak up first, are there any sort of like technological / social / legal approaches that we can do to sort of try and align company incentives to maximize their engagement with these issues of what's in the interest of society, especially in relationship to sort of misinformation and disinformation? Because obviously, there's incentives to get people watching as much content as possible, because they also then click on the adverts, for a lot of the big media companies. But how do we align that sort of business motivation better with some of these sort of emerging, well emerged at this point, social problems, especially in that misinformation, disinformation domain? Perhaps, Owen, you might start with that one.
So the way I reflect on this is probably the way that government helped engage with kind of big tobacco and now dealing with big oil, to recognize that these are health and societal ills, whether they're to do with kind of the health of a society. But this is where it becomes very challenging, because while the body of evidence around tobacco and oil has shown the damage it does to individual or environment, the challenge around mis and disinformation is that there are many gray areas in what people's beliefs are and how they align with some of the information that's presented to them. So I think some of the best ways to do this are to try and ensure the platforms offer balanced perspectives, that when news is emerging from different sources, I mean, many of the large platforms, so we're talking about the big social platforms, they can see within their social graphs where the news is being kind of circulated and shared and retweeted or propagated through, and they can see that there are going to be differences in how different parts of that social graph interact with material, even if the material at a surface kind of keyword level looks very similar. So I think obliging them to say, well, here's a story that you're looking at, and it's come up through your social graph, but here's what looks like to be a very similar story for balance coming up from a different trajectory in the social graph. The keywords seem to overlap, but to offer that as a balanced perspective. Now, the challenge here lies into how extreme do you offer those balanced perspectives? Do you go extreme right, extreme left, or are you trying to find those middle ground? And again, the way to identify this is often through the social graph, to see what type of information are people interacting with, and are they kind of falling very hard off to either side of that kind of spectrum. So I think offering balance is probably one of the first steps. And how, from a regulation perspective, you can ensure that, it's quite hard. But I think, that's the company side. Going back to it, I think as individual, it's on us to try and achieve that balance in our own browsing as a start point, because we are the people who are making decisions ultimately on this information, on who to vote for, what are the priorities in your life and in your society, and even down to the information you're disseminating to your family and to your kids and so on.
Yeah, and I don't know, Stephen, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that yourself, because that's, there's a continuum between, the policies around sort of securing and ensuring privacy, and then, how much should we be sharing, and how should that be, dealt with, especially by the large companies that are allowed to collect a lot of this information.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's essentially two approaches to this. One is a kind of a regulatory approach, and that can vary from specific regulations like GDPR, which is very detailed, up to breaking up companies for antitrust or competition law reasons. And I suspect a lot of that will be happening in the next decade or so. And I think that's probably a good thing for those giant companies. On the second approach is essentially technological, is that you can try and put in place technical measures to restrict who has visibility of what. And for example, Apple have been starting to do that. Apple, I think, are a company that they do make reasonable claims to care about your privacy from everybody except Apple, of course. But and we saw that when Apple kind of changed the permission model, a lot of advertising companies objected, or some companies said that their revenues went down because they weren't able to track people as much. So recently, Apple have introduced some technical means of making the details of your interaction with services less visible. And again, a lot of other companies who make revenue out of benefiting from that visibility will complain about that, and there'll be a fight amongst these large companies of various kinds. You would hope that the outcome of that kind of set of kind of technical measures would be that people would migrate towards the ones that are more privacy respecting, and away from those that are not. But again, it's that's where it comes down to choice. You can there's a lot of people on the internet, and when they change their behavior, service providers will move to match that. So we can do things ourselves by choosing with whom we interact.
Yeah, and I wonder as well with that, is there sometimes also a responsibility, like we see this in sort of on social networks, these technical features that get added by companies to perhaps report, harmful content or even sometimes misinformation. But that's not always widely taken up. And I see one person sort of had a question about these annoying robocalls that you get on your phone. So it's very easy on your phone to block that number from calling you again on your phone, but it's not so obvious how you report that number to your phone company or to someone who could block it from everybody else as well. So what is that sort of specific example? Are there ways that we could sort of support more crowdsourced action to deal more effectively with these harms, which are often sort of quite diffuse and collective? So we may be able to protect ourselves from some harm, but is there something we can do more individually, or should the companies be providing more usability features to allow us to do that? So I don't know, either Stephen or Owen or Claire, if you had any thoughts on those issues.
I wish I had answers to these, Dave, because these are some of the big questions, and I think going back to the idea that legislation lags behind kind of technology innovation and so on. I mean, you look at the introduction of the motor car and how the laws all had to catch up with those, the start of the last century. We're a very similar situation here, but the churn and rate of change of the technology, particularly the accessibility, having access to the internet is not a singular technology. It opens up a whole breadth and range of different possibilities. So I think all we can do is I think initially raise these with legislators or our elected officials in part, because I think that they do have a role here to step up and be familiar with this. And I think that's one of the challenges is you can have a disconnect that the kind of advice that they get on science, technology, or the introduction of this technology can be out of step, or their awareness can just be very different from the reality lived by many people. So that's a long way of saying is yes, we definitely introduce technological modes of, is it possible on a mobile phone to have a report this number button? Yeah, sure. But where's the incentive coming to introduce it? Is it us as consumers complaining to the telephone company who provides that service, and will they care enough to implement it? Or does the pressure need to come from somewhere else? And, I think, as we're seeing, there's a very large conversation around AI, and particularly people's ability to understand AI at the EU level. And, that's come about in a relatively short time frame, actually, compared to how long these conversations can take to kind of just spark up. So I think we will see an increased rate at which we have these conversations with our legislators, our elected officials, and then also the companies that are responsible for delivering these services, that will become hopefully a little bit nicer to us.
Yeah. Grant.
I can just speak to it, to the issue of robocalls. I mean, this is this has been a bigger problem historically over the last decade in North America than in Europe. And it got to in North America, they have a single numbering plan. So it's all, the country code is 1, but there's lots of phone companies. In Europe, we have fewer phone companies per country code. There is technology that's been developed that operates kind of between carriers in North America, called Stir and Shaken. And it's essentially a way of, as a call arrives into a carrier, they can check that it has some level of authenticity and associate some reputation with it, thereby enabling them to block sources of calls that are essentially these robocalls. And I think that has had some success in deployment in North America, largely driven by the FCC, so largely driven by the regulator saying, you must do this. But the technology does exist now that would provide the ability for telephone companies in all over Europe and more broadly to deploy something to reduce that problem. The initial experience of deployment is largely based around that North American numbering plan with just +1 for lots and lots of operators. So it doesn't quite map exactly well to a European context. But I think is something that regulators should be looking at imposing on telephone companies to do a better job. It won't solve the problem entirely, but they can certainly do a better job in filtering those robocalls.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. So I think we have time for a couple more quick questions. So I see Peter Wall made a good point talking about, I think reference to us or book by Churchill about, you could be sort of, well-read or know a lot of facts, but, you still need sometimes these sort of fundamental sort of critical faculties to deal with some of these issues. And I think, Owen, you talked about that earlier on. And I think perhaps going back to some of the questions we were asking you, Claire, certainly, these areas of sort of privacy and responsibility in AI development, is something that we're seeing, people getting their university education grappling with. But that basic sort of critical thinking, do you think we get enough of that, especially coming from the sort of the STEM subjects, through the people you see passing in front of you?
Yeah, I mean, when I think back to my own degree, I don't remember anything about ethics being in it, because it was all just about, writing up the code and how to design a tidy database and, real nuts and bolts stuff. It wasn't, they weren't necessarily thinking about the effect and impact that these things could have. And hindsight's always 2020, but now that we have that hindsight, I think we do need to sort of at least look at how people can be sort of taught how to consider the potential impacts of these things. Like, I know, Dave, you've done work with the ethics canvas based on sort of the business model canvas to help people tease out these sort of questions and queries and potential impacts, because it is really difficult sometimes to see the possible ripple effects of these things. Like, who would have thought adding a like button to Facebook would would be so damaging. It's such an innocuous idea in and of itself, but it has this massive effect. And if they'd done the ethics canvas with it, we might have a different world. So it definitely, if it isn't being done, I think it's definitely worthwhile to incorporate these things in better. But even at undergraduate level, I know there's lots of ethics committees and clearance for any sort of research that's being done at all within centres, but even just as regards sort of developing people's personal thought processes, because it will inform their life as regards just personal responsibility about sharing news, validating that it's actually robust, and sharing in a way that it's clear that it's a joke, if it is a joke, or if it's or if someone thinks it has veracity. That even just basic sort of things like that. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
Dave, it's probably worth adding in there. I mean, I think very significant initiatives that Trinity's had in the last 5 years around the Trinity electives. So this is aimed at undergraduate students, second year, third year, and the electives are deliberately set up to be cross-discipline and attract students from a variety of disciplines into them as a module. And for me, first off, that's really interesting. You've got students coming from various different epistemic kind of cultures, bringing them together, different methodological understandings of how to engage with material and content, and then look at really complex questions. So I'm involved in one that's titled Thinking Culturally, Thinking Digitally, and looks at the interaction of us and technology and how our societies evolve. I know yourself and Stephen drive a very interesting elective there. And I think exposing our students to this helps develop those critical skills, and also helps develop that awareness of multidisciplinarity and the importance it has in the modern world. The technology is not an isolated thing that we kind of take in and say, hey, here's this technology, isn't it great? It has so many repercussions, as Claire just said.
Yeah. And I think the really interesting thing about those electives is they're in these multidisciplinary classes, so we're putting them into groups where that's a computer scientist and a medic and a fine art student having to write an essay about internet privacy, and I think just in fact the different levels of sort of critical thinking and different modes of thinking and the exchange of that even beyond what we deliver to them in the lectures is very useful. Okay, I think we're probably nearly finished. There's just one last question that I saw that I think is something we haven't discussed, which is but is in sort of the area of ADAPT. Is Dora Goldring was asking, how dangerous is facial recognition? This is a technology that's getting a lot of interest in the media currently. So I don't know, a quick sort of happy or sad face on that from each of our participants. Do they see? So thumbs down from Stephen and from Owen. Claire, what's your thoughts? Thumbs down all round. So yes, facial recognition definitely. Interestingly, in the there's a new act going through the European Parliament on regulating AI, and one of the few things it actually lays down a prohibition on is at least governmental use of what it calls remote biometrics, primarily face recognition in public spaces. So I think that is already getting a big negative reaction. I think probably I'm just looking to our convener. I think we're probably out of time. Is that right, Megan? So we probably don't have enough space to fit in any more questions. So I think perhaps we might just wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was an absolutely brilliant discussion. I think we've hit on a lot of different topics in a very short time period. And there are a lot of questions there and that you answered pretty comprehensively. So thank you very, very much to Owen, Stephen and Claire for your thoughts on the different strands of what we won't call cybersecurity anymore. Thank you, Stephen. It's been a really, really interesting afternoon. I hope everybody enjoyed it. And it was really great to have such enthusiastic audience participation. I'm just sorry we couldn't get to all the questions in one go. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Dave for leading the discussion today, and to all our speakers for generously giving of their time and hopefully helping all of us feel a little bit better equipped to deal with navigating our own security online and figuring out what to trust and what not, and what might be true and what mightn't. Maybe I'll just take a few minutes to think about it a little bit more before we click on things. I'd also like to thank my colleague Alexandra Owens, who's been sitting in the background there and helping put this webinar together. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for listening and for joining us today. If you'd like more information on any of today's topics, I'm just going to share my screen here. And you'll see links there for you to various things that some of our speakers talked about, including a link to the ADAPT Centre, which our panelists are involved with, the Provenance project that Owen mentioned, and materials from a module at Trinity that Dave and Stephen teach, which is called What is the Internet Doing to Me? So you can get the materials through that on the links there. These links will also be included in an email that will go around later today. If you have any questions or comments regarding the webinar series or other questions you'd like to ask us here at Trinity Development and Alumni, you can reach us at the email address on screen, alumni@tcd.ie. I'm sorry to say that this has been our final webinar for the 2021 series of Inspiring Ideas at Trinity, but I am happy to say that we'll be back in the new year with a whole new lineup of brilliant guest speakers and fascinating topics starting in January 2022. We will be in touch in the new year with information about the next series and how to register for the first one in January. I hope you've enjoyed this year's series and are looking forward to next year's. Thank you once again for joining us, and until 2022, take care.